Every great empire eventually becomes the prisoner of its own mythology, and Russia is no exception, perhaps the most mythologized nation in the entire modern world. In the winter of 1917, in a Petrograd that smelled of coal smoke and revolution, the Romanov dynasty collapsed not with a dramatic coup, but with a slow grinding exhaustion that almost nobody had predicted and almost everybody later misremembered. How did one of the most powerful imperial states in European history become, within a matter of days, a ghost, and why have the stories told about that collapse, and about Russian history more broadly, been so consistently, so stubbornly, so dangerously wrong? Let us start at the beginning, not the beginning of Russia, but the beginning of the myths, because the myths about Russian history are not accidental. They were manufactured, maintained, and weaponized, sometimes by the Russian state itself, sometimes by its enemies, sometimes by well-meaning scholars who simply did not read the sources carefully enough. And they have consequences. They shape how people understand Russian expansionism, Russian culture, Russian religiosity, Russian violence. They shape foreign policy. They shape how Russians understand themselves. So if you want to understand Russia, really understand it, you have to be willing to demolish some very comfortable stories. The first and perhaps most persistent myth is the idea that Russia has always been an autocracy, that authoritarianism is somehow baked into Russian civilization at the genetic level, that Russians are uniquely suited to or uniquely tolerant of despotic rule. You will hear this in think tanks, in op-ed pages, in undergraduate seminars. The argument usually goes something like this: Russia was shaped by the Mongol yoke, by the vast flat steppe, by orthodox submission, by centuries of serfdom. Russians, the argument implies, simply do not want freedom the way Western Europeans do. This is not history. This is myth dressed up as geopolitics. Here's what the actual record shows. In Novgorod, one of the great medieval cities of Northern Europe, a republican civic tradition flourished for centuries. The Novgorodian Veche, the popular assembly, exercised genuine political power from at least the 12th century onward. Citizens gathered in the square before the Cathedral of St. Sophia, rang the great bell, and debated and voted on matters of war, trade, and governance. Novgorod elected its own magistrates, called posadniki, and could and did expel princes it found unsatisfactory. This was not a minor curiosity. Novgorod was a major commercial hub in the Hanseatic trading world, with a sophisticated legal culture and a merchant class that negotiated with German, Swedish, and Flemish partners. It was not some pale imitation of Western freedom. It was a genuine indigenous Russian civic tradition, and it was destroyed deliberately, violently, systematically, not by some ancient Russian instinct for submission, but by a specific man in a specific place in a specific year. Ivan III, in 1478, crushed Novgorodian independence, executed its leaders, deported its merchant families, and had the famous Veche bell, the literal symbol of civic voice, removed and taken to Moscow. The bell did not fall silent because Russians were incapable of self-governance. It was silenced by a conqueror. That matters enormously, because the destruction of Novgorod was not the expression of a Russian cultural essence. It was a political act with political consequences. And if you understand it that way, you begin to see that Russian authoritarianism is not a destiny. It is a history of specific decisions, specific violences, specific institutional choices. That distinction is not merely academic. It changes everything about how you interpret the next 500 years. But there is another myth lurking just beneath the surface of the first one, and it is almost the mirror image. Some Western commentators and some Russian liberals have argued that Russia's problem is that it was never really part of Europe, that it was always fundamentally Asian, fundamentally other, fundamentally beyond the reach of the Enlightenment. This is equally wrong, and the evidence against it is overwhelming. Peter the Great's reforms in the early 18th century were not simply a thin Western veneer painted over an Asian substrate. They were a genuine, if brutal and top-down transformation of Russian elite culture, administration, military organization, and urban life. By the mid-18th century, St. Petersburg, built on a Finnish swamp at enormous human cost, with tens of thousands of laborers dying during its construction, was one of the most architecturally sophisticated cities in Europe. The Winter Palace, completed under Empress Elizabeth in 1762, contained over 1,000 rooms and housed one of the greatest art collections on the continent. Russian nobles read Voltaire and Rousseau in the original French. Catherine the Great corresponded with the philosophers, commissioned neoclassical architecture, codified law, and founded the Russian Academy of Arts. Russia was not outside Europe. It was a contested, complicated, often contradictory part of Europe, and that tension between European aspiration and Russian particularity was itself one of the great driving engines of Russian intellectual life. Which brings us to the Westernizers and the Slavophiles, and to a myth that has deformed the understanding of 19th century Russian thought almost beyond recognition. The standard story, the one you find in many Western textbooks, presents this debate as a simple binary. Westernizers wanted Russia to become like Europe. Slavophiles wanted to reject Europe and retreat into a mystical Russian soul. But this flattens an extraordinarily rich and complicated intellectual argument into a cartoon. The Slavophiles, figures like Ivan Kirevsky, Alexei Komiakov, and Konstantin Aksakov, writing in Moscow in the 1840s, were not reactionary nationalists in the modern sense. They were deeply educated men, many of whom had studied in Germany and were thoroughly familiar with Hegel and Schelling. Their critique of the West was not a rejection of reason. It was a critique of what they saw as the atomizing, alienating tendencies of Western rationalism and individualism. They believed that the Russian peasant commune, the Obshchina, embodied a form of communal solidarity that Western capitalism was destroying in Europe. They were wrong about many things, and their idealization of the peasantry was often sentimental to the point of delusion. But they were not simply anti-modern. And the Westernizers, for their part, were not simply imitators of France or England. Alexander Herzen, perhaps the greatest Russian political thinker of the 19th century, ended his life deeply disillusioned with Western liberalism after watching the failures of 1848. He came to believe that Russia might actually leap over capitalism to a form of agrarian socialism rooted in the commune, a position that influenced the populist movement of the 1870s and indirectly the revolutionary tradition that would eventually produce 1917. The debate between Westernizers and Slavophiles was not a debate between progress and reaction. It was a debate about what kind of modernity was possible and desirable, and it is still unresolved. Now let us talk about the myth that has probably done more damage than any other. The myth of the October Revolution as a popular uprising. This is a myth that was cultivated with enormous energy by Soviet propaganda for 70 years, and it has proven remarkably durable even after the archives opened. The standard Soviet image, workers and soldiers storming the Winter Palace, the masses rising spontaneously against Tsarist oppression, was almost entirely fabricated. The actual seizure of power in Petrograd on the night of October 25th to 26th, 1917 by the old Julian calendar was a coup carried out by a disciplined, organized minority. The Bolsheviks, under Lenin's direction and Trotsky's military coordination, used the Military Revolutionary Committee of the Petrograd Soviet to seize key infrastructure, telegraph offices, railway stations, bridges, the state bank, with relatively little resistance and relatively little popular participation. The storming of the Winter Palace, immortalized in Sergei Eisenstein's 1927 film October, was largely a staged recreation. Contemporary accounts describe a chaotic, almost farcical event in which the provisional government's defenders melted away. The palace was entered through unlocked doors, and the ministers were arrested without significant bloodshed. Eisenstein's film, made a decade later for the 10th anniversary of the revolution, created the visual mythology that would be mistaken for documentary reality by generations of viewers worldwide. This does not mean the Bolsheviks had no popular support. They did, particularly among industrial workers in Petrograd and Moscow, among soldiers exhausted by 3 years of catastrophic war, and among sailors at the Kronstadt naval base. But their support was concentrated, specific, and conditional. The peasantry, which constituted roughly 80% of Russia's population, was largely indifferent or hostile to Bolshevik ideology. The socialist revolutionaries, not the Bolsheviks, were the party with genuine mass support in the countryside. In the elections to the Constituent Assembly held in November 1917, just weeks after the Bolshevik seizure of power, the Bolsheviks received approximately 24% of the vote. The Socialist Revolutionaries received approximately 40%. Lenin's response to this democratic verdict was to dissolve the Constituent Assembly by force in January 1918, after it had met for exactly 1 day. The Red Guards physically dispersed the delegates. This was not the will of the people expressing itself. This was a minority using organized violence to prevent the majority from governing. And the civil war that followed, that catastrophic multi-sided conflict that killed millions through combat, famine, and disease between 1918 and 1922, was in large part the consequence of that original act of democratic suppression. But here is where the story gets even more complicated, because there is an equally powerful countermyth that needs to be demolished. The myth that the Bolsheviks were simply German agents, that Lenin was a paid instrument of the Kaiser, that the revolution was essentially a foreign conspiracy with no genuine Russian roots. This argument, which was popular among white émigrés, among some Western conservatives, and which has enjoyed a revival in certain nationalist circles, is also wrong, or at least wildly overstated. Yes, the German government facilitated Lenin's return to Russia in April 1917, providing the famous sealed train that carried him from Zurich through Germany and Sweden to Petrograd. Yes, German intelligence provided financial support to Bolshevik operations during 1917 as part of a strategy to destabilize Russia and knock it out of the war. These are documented facts. But to reduce the Bolshevik Revolution to German manipulation is to misunderstand both the depth of Russian social crisis and the genuine ideological conviction of the Bolshevik leadership. Lenin was not a German agent. He was a Russian revolutionary who accepted German money because it served his own purposes and whose purposes were diametrically opposed to Germany's long-term interests. The moment the Bolsheviks consolidated power, they were pursuing a global communist revolution that threatened every existing government, including Berlin. The German gamble backfired spectacularly, and within a year the Kaiser's empire had itself collapsed, partly under the pressure of revolutionary agitation inspired by Russian events. Let us turn now to a myth about Stalin that is simultaneously too large and too small. The myth that is too large, that Stalin was simply a continuation of Lenin, that Bolshevism always and inevitably led to Stalinism, that the terror was baked into the revolution from the first day. The myth that is too small, that Stalin was a unique, inexplicable monster whose crimes were purely the product of personal psychopathology, disconnected from any structural or ideological context. Both of these positions are wrong, and the truth lies in a more uncomfortable place. Stalin did not simply inherit Lenin's system and run it as designed. He transformed it. The institutionalized terror of the late 1930s, the Great Purge, the show trials, the mass operations of 1937 and 1938 that killed approximately 750,000 people, according to NKVD records, with millions more sent to the Gulag, went far beyond anything Lenin had envisioned or practiced. Lenin used terror instrumentally as a tool of civil war and state consolidation. Stalin used it as a permanent governing technology, turning it against the party itself, against the military leadership, against the very people who had made the revolution. The purge of the Red Army Officer Corps between 1937 and 1938, which killed 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, and roughly 35,000 officers at various levels, was not a Leninist policy. It was a Stalinist pathology, and it very nearly cost the Soviet Union the war against Germany. When the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border in June 1941, the Red Army was led by men who had been promoted 2 or 3 ranks beyond their experience because their superiors had been shot. But Stalin's terror also had structural and ideological roots that extended beyond his personal paranoia. The Soviet system created incentives for denunciation, for the inflation of enemy finding, for the production of confessions. Local NKVD officers were given quotas, literal numerical targets for arrests and executions, in the mass operations of 1937 and 1938. The system rewarded zeal and punished failure to find enemies. This was not purely Stalin's invention. It was the product of a political culture that had been building since the Civil War, a culture that divided the world into reliable comrades and hidden enemies, that treated suspicion as a form of vigilance and mercy as a form of weakness. Stalin intensified and weaponized these tendencies, but he did not create them from nothing. Understanding this does not diminish his personal responsibility. It increases our understanding of how totalitarian systems function, how they recruit ordinary people into extraordinary crimes. Now consider the myth about the Russian Orthodox Church, a myth that cuts in 2 opposite directions simultaneously. On one side, there is the Western liberal myth that Orthodox Christianity was always the handmaiden of Tsarist oppression, a purely conservative institution that blessed autocracy and suppressed dissent. On the other side, there is the Russian nationalist myth that the Church was the eternal guardian of Russian identity, uncorrupted by politics, a spiritual refuge that survived every storm. Both are wrong. The relationship between the Russian state and the Orthodox Church is one of the most complex and contested in European religious history. Peter the Great in 1721 abolished the Patriarchate, the office of the head of the Russian Church, and replaced it with the Holy Synod, a bureaucratic body controlled by a lay official called the Chief Procurator, appointed by the Tsar. This was not a minor administrative change. It was the subordination of the Church to the state in an almost Erastian sense, transforming the Russian Orthodox Church into something closer to a department of government than an independent spiritual institution. For nearly 2 centuries, the Church was constrained, monitored, and managed by the imperial bureaucracy. Priests were required to report confessions that touched on matters of state security, a requirement that created an agonizing conflict between sacramental duty and legal obligation. The Church hierarchy was deeply conservative, yes, but it was conservative partly because independence was dangerous. Figures who pushed too hard, like the reforming Metropolitan Filarete of Moscow, who navigated court politics with extraordinary skill across the reigns of 5 Tsars, did so at considerable personal risk. And yet the Church was also the site of genuine spiritual vitality, of popular religiosity that the state could not fully control. The tradition of the startsi, the spiritual elders who lived in monasteries and attracted pilgrims from across Russia, represented a form of religious authority that operated somewhat outside the official hierarchy. Figures like Seraphim of Sarov, who died in 1833 and was canonized in 1903, were beloved by ordinary Russians in ways that had nothing to do with state approval. Tolstoy's famous excommunication in 1901 for his radical Christian anarchism, his rejection of church sacraments, his attacks on the institutional church showed that the Church could still act with some independence when its doctrinal authority was directly challenged. The relationship between faith, institution, and state power in Russian Orthodoxy was never simple, and reducing it to either pure oppression or pure spiritual authenticity misses the lived complexity of millions of people's religious experience. Which brings us finally to perhaps the most consequential myth of all, the myth about what the Soviet Union actually was and what its collapse actually meant. The dominant Western narrative of the Cold War presented the Soviet Union as a monolithic, unchanging totalitarian system, essentially static from Stalin's consolidation of power in the late 1920s until its sudden, surprising collapse in 1991. This narrative served important political purposes during the Cold War, but as history, it is deeply misleading. The Soviet Union changed enormously across its 74-year existence. The Khrushchev thaw of the late 1950s and early 1960s was a genuine, if limited, liberalization, the release of millions of Gulag prisoners, the partial acknowledgement of Stalinist crimes, the opening of cultural space that produced some of the greatest literature, cinema, and poetry of the 20th century. Figures like Alexander Solzhenitsyn, whose novella One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich was published in the literary journal Novy Mir in 1962, with Khrushchev's personal approval, were not operating in a system identical to Stalin's. They were operating in a system that was genuinely uncertain about its own past and genuinely contested about its own future. The Brezhnev era, often dismissed as the period of stagnation, was also more complicated than the caricature suggests. Yes, the economy was calcifying, the political system was gerontocratic, and the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 crushed the Prague Spring and signaled the limits of reform. But Soviet society in the 1970s was not the terrorized, atomized society of the 1930s. People told political jokes. They read samizdat, self-published underground literature that circulated in typed carbon copies through networks of trust. They listened to Western music on bootleg recordings called Röntgenizdat, pressed onto discarded X-ray film. They found ways to live alongside the system, around the system, and occasionally against the system in ways that the totalitarian model simply cannot capture. And the collapse of 1991, the event that Vladimir Putin famously called the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, was not simply the triumph of Western liberalism over Soviet communism, as the triumphalist narrative of the 1990s insisted. It was a genuine multidimensional crisis that combined economic failure, national awakening, institutional decay, and elite defection in ways that are still being analyzed. The 15 successor states that emerged from the Soviet collapse had radically different experiences of what followed. For the Baltic states, Independence was a restoration of national sovereignty interrupted by Soviet occupation. For Central Asian republics, it was something far more ambiguous, the inheritance of Soviet-drawn borders, Soviet-created national identities, and Soviet-built industrial infrastructure, all without the Soviet subsidies that had made them function. For Russia itself, the 1990s were a decade of catastrophic economic contraction, demographic crisis, and institutional collapse that produced a mortality crisis comparable in some respects to wartime. Male life expectancy in Russia fell from 64 years in 1990 to 57 years in 1994. This was not a transition to prosperity. It was a social catastrophe. And understanding why many Russians look back on the Soviet period with nostalgia requires understanding what they actually lived through in its aftermath, not as an endorsement of Soviet repression, but as a human response to genuine suffering. The myths about Russian history are not innocent. They are not merely scholarly errors to be corrected in footnotes. They shape how wars are justified, how sanctions are designed, how populations are mobilized, how leaders are understood or misunderstood. The myth of eternal Russian authoritarianism makes structural change seem impossible and removes agency from ordinary Russians who have repeatedly and at great cost attempted to build different kinds of political life. The myth of the spontaneous popular revolution obscures the actual mechanics of how minority political movements seize and hold power, a lesson with obvious relevance far beyond Russia. The myth of the monolithic Soviet Union makes it impossible to understand how the system actually functioned, how it generated both genuine believers and genuine resistors, how it changed across time, and why its collapse took the forms it did. Russia is a country of extraordinary complexity, a country that produced both the Gulag and Tolstoy, both the Terror and the Thaw, both the silencing of the Novgorod bell and the ringing of every church bell across the empire for the coronation of a new Tsar. It is a country whose history has been written and rewritten by every generation to serve the needs of the present, and whose past is therefore always, in some sense, a battlefield. The most honest thing a historian can do, the most useful thing this essay can offer, is not to replace old myths with new ones, but to sit with the complexity, to follow the evidence where it leads, to resist the temptation of the clean story when the messy one is true, because the messy story is always more interesting, and in the case of Russia, it is also more important than almost anything else you will learn this year.